Hello, everyone. My name is Alla Marchenko. I'm a president of Aurora Philosophy Institute. Our speaker this evening is Emilia Leese, who will be presenting the topic, Think Like a Vegan. Veganism is for everybody. Emilia is the co-author, Think Like a Vegan, what everyone can learn about vegan ethics, about the essence of veganism, and why is it a moral imperative. Emilia also a rewilder, podcast host, public speaker, and magazine editor, and has developed life skills and ethic workshop for underserved youth. She has been a corporate lawyer for over 20 years. Emily and her husband Roger live in London and the Scottish Highlands. If you're watching on YouTube channel, please subscribe, make comments, and press the like button. And if you really like it, then you can press the donate button, and any contribution, no matter how big or small, would be greatly appreciated. Welcome, Emilia.
Thank you so much, Alla, and thanks so much for having me this evening. I really appreciate it. So my name is Emilia Leese, and I'm the co-author of Think Like a Vegan, a book that came out in North America last summer, and I have a podcast by the same name. And then you've heard all the other things, and you can ask questions about those if you have them. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here this evening to chat with you about a topic that I think there's still a lot of confusion about what it is and what it isn't, and about the practice of it. And it's certainly an ethical practice, and they're certainly underpinned by a philosophy. So I will go through an overview really about what is veganism. And let me just say right off the bat, there are no scary pictures. We will just talk about concepts. We will talk about ethics. We will talk a little bit about history. And because veganism is very much concerned with also very factual things beyond just ethics, but indeed it has a very, very factual representation in our day-to-day life in terms of what we eat, and in terms of animals and land use and so forth. I will also be interweaving a bit of what the ethics look like on a day-to-day basis, and what it looks like in terms of environment, and in terms of entanglements with human issues and so forth. So here's the agenda for this evening, and that's basically what we're going to go through. And then at the end, absolutely happy to answer your questions. So starting things off, us and them. Is there really an us and them? And I hope that tonight I can just ask you to pull back from an anthropocentric and human-centered worldview to one that puts us on the same level, on the same plane as other animals. So we have human animals and non-human animals. And I read this quote from an introduction about a book on lichen, actually, of all things. But I read this quote by Emanuele Coccia, who's a philosopher in Paris. And he says, the existence of species is not an ontological fact. It's a practical one. And life belongs to all species, and the powers that defines each of them must be held in common. So I thought, I really liked the quote quite separately, and then I was looking at the symbol for the API, and here is this tree of life. And even in Plato's myth, the multiplicity of species, he describes it as inherently arbitrary and governed more by religion and politics than the reality of the interdependence and mutual necessity of survival of all of us. Indeed, biodiversity is absolutely essential. So in thinking about this quote and looking at your symbol, I thought, well, interdependence of species, trees, tree of life, it really worked really well, quite fortuitously. We're all interconnected in a web of life rather than a linear taxonomy. So if we just use this as a conduit to stepping away from the idea of a human-centered world, it would be really helpful. And first things first, what does vegan actually mean? And some of you may be familiar with this, some know, so I'm going to assume that most people don't know. So veganism, it's very simple. It's to the extent possible and practicable. Vegans avoid using animals for food, clothing, entertainment, or other purposes. We don't consume animal flesh or fish or insects, mollusks, eggs, dairy, cheese, and honey, and we don't ride horses, visit zoos or aquariums, and we don't wear leather, fur, wool, or silk. What we do eat is basically everything: fruits, grains, legumes, vegetables, and so on. Anything, all those things that exist in our world that aren't animal-based. The term vegan, and this will go into the history a little bit. The term vegan was developed in 1944, was coined by Donald Watson and his subsequently wife, Dorothy Morgan. When they developed it, she wasn't his wife yet. And the two of them, it was a reaction to a shift in vegetarianism, where vegetarians had been adding back animal products, eggs and dairy. And Donald Watson and Dorothy Morgan at the time felt that wasn't, the term vegetarian was no longer fit for purpose. And so they came up with the term vegan. Having said that, veganism isn't simply a European or a Western thing at all. You have on the left-hand side of your screen a little print there of Tiruvalluvar, who was a Tamil poet in 500 Common Era. He wrote the Tirukural, which was a collection of couplets on ethics and political and economical matters and love, and his followers and he were vegan. And then in the center there, you'll see the flag of the Rastafari movement, which began in the 1930s, and most Rastafari follow their food. They call it ital, and basically it's from the word vital, and mostly it's vegan. Not all Rastafari are vegan, but many are. And to the right here is an example of Shojin Rory food from Buddhist temple monks from the 13th century Japan and Korea. So the term vegan is from 1944, but there were plenty of people living as vegans or practicing as vegans before that. So if our talk were to finish today, so I've given you a historical sort of overview, but basically, why vegan? What is the basic idea? So this is the definition, you've got the history, but what is it? So I can give you this 30-second elevator pitch. If our conversation were to end right here, this would basically be the fundamental message that, like us, animals aren't things. They feel, they think, they dream, they play, they have friends and families. And all of these things, they do them differently than us, for sure. And as time goes by, we learn more and more about animal behaviors and how similar they are to expressions of what we do. And animals have different intelligence and skills than we do. And obviously, most look very different from us. Ultimately, so what? We all look different and live differently and have different intelligence and skills from one another. None of these external reasons are good enough to exploit and kill anyone. All of us, human or animal, want to live. We all don't want to be exploited and used as objects. And that is the most basic why vegan that encompasses the ethics and the practical aspect that you will probably see. And part of the reason we wrote that Eva Karambides, my co-author, and I wrote the book was precisely to give a very practical and digestible and accessible understanding of veganism. So the 30-second elevator pitch and the whole idea of animals aren't things, and like us, they want to live and so forth, draws on a very basic concept. Because there's lots of different ways to come at the ideas and the ethics of it, but we really believe that stripping it back to the fundamental basics of fairness is really at the core of it all, and that strips it away from on any ideas of centering the ethics on us rather than on who we should be focusing on. So basic fairness, what is it? And we can all understand that. So basic fairness, you afford the same moral treatment to everyone unless there's a morally relevant reason to justify treating someone differently. So, whether I give a very basic example there. We don't allow human children or non-human animals to vote. And we have different reasons. We say, well, children can't enter into contracts, they're not yet fully developed to vote, and so on. So we already have this concept of choosing morally relevant reasons to justify a different type of treatment. And so then we have to say, okay, so basic fairness, okay, I get it. Basic fairness to people, I totally get. But how are people and animals the same that we should then afford them basic fairness? Well, we're all animals. We all belong to the animal kingdom, with humans evolving later than many other animal species. All animals, including people, aren't objects. And we understand this when we look at our companion animals. And fundamentally, it's not even a new concept. Pythagoras talked about this, Maimonides talked about this, and many more philosophers and ethicists in between and since and contemporary times have been talking about this. And obviously, Pythagoras and Maimonides discussed animals in different ways and thinking about souls, and there may have been a bit more of a religious context, but nevertheless, there was this idea that they were not objects, that they didn't see animals as objects. And the last point, the last similarity, and I think the most important one, is sentience. All animals are sentient. Now, sentience. People get caught up in making sentience something a lot more complicated than it needs to be, and that I think it doesn't actually become very useful when it becomes complicated. Sentience simply means having a desire to live. It's not whether one animal or another has imagination, or they have an expectation of time or an understanding of time, or that they're able to do some activity or another based on what people can do. And people themselves have different abilities to do any of those things. So sentience has to be something that's a lot more basic, and it's that desire to live, that one more moment. And so, given all this, why should we share the same moral sphere? Well, we all have needs, we all have wants, fears, abilities, intelligence, skills, social habits, and emotions. And we all demonstrate these ways in ways that are similar and different to humans. Humans have a variety, have a whole spectrum of ways in which we express all these qualities, and animals do too. And all of these things are all external. Again, these aren't morally relevant differences. They just, you have one animal may be intelligent, another one may be less intelligent, one may be more intelligent than a 3-year-old or a 7-year-old. You hear all these different comparisons. And, so what? One may be cute, the other less so. One may be rare, one may be super common. Again, these differences are external, they're externalities. They don't determine whether an animal should forfeit their life, which is what, what the reality is. So what's relevant? Again, it's the shared sentience. That's the only morally relevant starting point from which to determine whether the rule of fairness also applies to animals. And again, that sentience is simply that desire to live that one more moment, not any of these externalities, and certainly not any of the externalities compared to what humans can do. Because again, if we are always thinking about an average human, we're again creating a figure that doesn't actually exist. So you've now heard me talk about the sentience and the fairness and so forth. What you haven't heard me say is kindness or compassion and all of that. I don't see that those things are very important, but I don't believe that they are, and we need them. We need all those things. We need kindness and we need compassion. But when we're talking about animals, what we're talking about is use. Because, so let me give you an analogy. So you're swimming in a polluted river, and the analogy is similar to what using animals is an analogous problem. So you swim in a polluted river, and you get sick. You go to the doctor helps you out. Then you go swimming in the polluted river again. Once again, you get sick. You go back to the doctor helps you out. That's going to the doctor is really important, but you're never going to get to the crux of the matter until you actually solve the problem of the polluted river. And similarly, when we talk about the treatment of animals and whether we treat them humanely or any of those things, we've already made the assumption that it's okay to use them. So whenever we talk about in our book, we only talk about, we focus on use as the problem. Being concerned with how animals are treated before the animal becomes food or clothing is absolutely relevant, of course, but it's the same as a recurring infection. The cycle won't end unless you address the cause. And I think it's really important to stop and think about use as it's not an automatic yes, of course, because there's lots that we should be considering, even well before we get to, oh, well, how are we going to treat animals? So what does the basic rule of fairness, including animals, look like? Now, the reality of the matter is that when it comes to animals, we routinely ignore the basic rule of fairness. We deny them the fundamental right to live. This isn't a judgment. And this isn't even a philosophical matter, quite frankly. It is an absolute reality, and it has been an absolute reality about how the entire world lives, and pretty much, I'm going to say 99.9% of the world still lives. It's just the norm, and it has been like that for at least 10,000 years when we started animal agriculture and farming animals. So it was a shift in how humans developed. And that doesn't mean that something needs to consider, to continue just because it has existed for as long as it has. So basic rule of fairness, including animals. We owe animals the same moral treatment as people, unless there's a morally relevant reason to justify treating animals differently. We don't, or at least we can agree that we shouldn't deny humans fundamental rights if they have needs, wants, fears, abilities, intelligence, skills, social habits, or emotions, or any other quality and characteristic that we identify. And understanding that we owe a group the same moral treatment is very important, because it makes it clear that these essential rights aren't something that we give and take as we fancy or as a matter of kindness. And again, going back to what I was talking about before, kindness and compassion, those are given. You don't have a right to those. They're very nice to have, and they're extremely important, but we don't have a right to those. But we do have a right to our own integrity, and we have a right to not be exploited as objects. We, meaning people. Animals do not yet have this right. So then you're saying, well, gosh, well, what are you talking about here? Well, when I look at questions about animal issues, animal problems, or if somebody says, oh, Emmy, I've got this issue, somebody's talking about using this product or eating this or going to doing this thing, how should I look at it? Well, I always try to shift things around and say, well, what would be the answer in a human context, and how would that, if it would differ, how would it differ, and why would it differ if I were talking about an animal? So in a human context, and this is again a very basic sort of wheel, you have the oppressed group, or the group in question, and then you have, from that, you think about all the other issues that come off of that spoke. So you have other forms of oppression, you have health, economics, environment, and other people and other actors. So again, if we're talking about it in a context of animals, you would say, in the center, you would put animals. And then from there, you would say, well, how do all these other relevant questions and discussions, how do those affect the group that I am focused on, and in particular, animals? With that said, and again, now I'm shifting a bit more into the human and animal entanglements. One of the things that I'm always careful about, and that I always stress, is when we're talking human analogies, we're not equating human suffering and animal suffering, or minimizing human suffering at all. We're just using our understanding of human injustice and unfairness to expand our circle and include all sentient beings. And that helps us to develop a deeper understanding about our actions, and about the impact of our actions and the effects of our actions and our choices on animals, and, well, frankly, on others as well. And again, continuing in the human entanglements vein, one of the things that's extremely important, and that is very much beginning to be discussed in the vegan world, is the rejection of bigotry as a whole. Veganism isn't just this hyper focus only on animals. Yes, there is the injustice of animal use, but systemic injustices exist. and they're all related and interconnected. And when we understand and look at veganism in a deeper way, and we seek a fairer world for animals, then we have to then also recognize that seeking a fairer world for humans is also important, and it's also vital. So, and the goals are never mutually exclusive, and they're not mutually exclusive ideas either, because you see the vulnerability of one and you recognize the vulnerability in the other. And frankly, and this is, yes, it's a human entanglement, but also a very practical one. You can oppose, fight, address, dismantle. You can learn about and read and talk about all the human injustices while you just stick to eating plants. So it's not an impediment. Neither is an impediment to the other. So how does veganism entangle? Oh, hold on a second. It does not seem to be. Here we go. Now it's clicking forward. That's good. So how does veganism get entangled with human ethical concerns? So we have feminism. The very basic, females of other species are exploited for their reproductive systems. And this is, I don't have a slide on this, but I think I should just address it. So just want to make sure that everybody's on the same page about this. Dairy cows have to give birth to a baby cow in order to lactate, very much like all other mammals on the earth. And it's the same thing. And the process has to continue. Lactation doesn't just spontaneously happen, and it isn't an endless source. There has to be a impregnation, then gestation, and then a birth in order to have lactation. So, and in terms of eggs, it's a very similar thing. You have egg-laying chickens that lay lots of eggs that have been sort of bred to lay a tremendous number of eggs, certainly in comparison to their wild cousins. And then the eggs are sort of sorted, they're sexed. If the chick hatches and it's a boy chick, they get pretty much slaughtered immediately, and then you have other eggs that are hatched that are female chickens, then they are also put back into the whole reproductive system again. And if it's just simply eggs without their being hatched, obviously those are being produced by female egg-laying hens. So you have an exploitation of a female species, different than our own, but nevertheless, that is to me, for me personally, that was my trigger and my recognition of why I decided to go vegan. It was that exploitation that I couldn't abide by. Then we have issues of race. Veganism is simply one fitting response to systemic issues of race, colorism, migration, and ethnicity. I have this little chart for US workers, and these are, and amazingly, and I've had these discussions in various countries where I've been able to travel for talks and vegan events and so forth, that it's a very similar thing, that in animal slaughter and processing, you tend to have migrants, people who are on the margins of society, who have very limited educational possibilities and opportunities, as well as falling along racial lines and along colorist lines. And I think that these these numbers are pretty astonishing. And I'm sure that you've heard over the last couple of years, there have, especially during COVID, there have been a lot of different exposés about children working in animal slaughter and processing plants, as well as of foreign-born workers and migrant workers. And okay, then the other thing that is both ethical and practical. So the environment. We have global farmland. 82% of global farmland is used for animal agriculture, while animal agriculture itself only provides about 18% of the calories of the global diet. And this quite disparate food system, tends to also very much affect people who live, for example, you have in Brazil, and we'll talk about soya in a minute, you have land grabs in the Amazon, to which then these land grabs displace people who have been living in those forests for a very long time, indigenous people, as well as non-indigenous, but who have been living there for a very long time. And the land grabs are generally so that soya can be planted, and then that eventually they also become pastures. So there is this real conflict between animal agriculture and people. And just again, we're talking about the practical realities. The land animals that are slaughtered annually, those are big numbers. And the focus here is land animals because it's aquatic animals, especially caught in the wild. Those numbers are practically impossible to count because of how the process of fishing actually happens. They generally, the catch cannot be counted until it gets to port, and then but there's tons and tons of bycatch that happens at sea, and that never gets counted. So the data points that are most accurate are on land animals. And see, it's very strange. The machine is doing its own thing, but okay. So then we say, okay, Emmy, you're talking about, you have the sentience of animals, and you have taken sentience to a very basic level. But what about plants? Okay, plants are absolutely complex and living beings. And actually, on my podcast, in the first season of my podcast, I spoke with a very interesting professor of law. Her name is Manisha Dekka, and she has written, she's developed a theory about beingness, and of looking at different levels of beingness, from humans to animals to plants, and showing how our current system, which is really just focused on an ideal human, and however that's defined, is insufficient even to take into account the plants and the natural environment all around us. It's absolutely fascinating. I highly recommend her work. And she's in a Canadian university, I can't remember which one off the top of my head. But anyway, getting back to plants. Plants, we should absolutely be concerned about deforestation, and we should absolutely be concerned about monocultures and so forth. But taking the concern about plants, when we use 82% of farmland for animal agriculture, we are killing a lot more plants than we would if we were to just eat plants. So you have global soybean production and use. 75% of the global soybean production is going into animal feed. And that animal feed is not just for land animals, but it's also for farmed fish. And I know that's very surprising, but soya is an extremely rich and nutritious bean for all the animals, including ourselves. And so that's why it's used, particularly the soya that's grown in Brazil. It's extremely nutritious, and it serves as excellent animal feed. So our concern about plants is absolutely valid, but if we eat plants, we are actually, if we only eat plants, we are actually killing fewer plants than we do when we eat animals and plants. And so then talking about plants and land and how we use land, this slide here is a very interesting one because it shows, so this is a map of the United Kingdom. And if you, now it looks like it would be labeled as if the areas are where these different activities happen, but no, it's actually more of a pie chart. If you can imagine, the map is actually a pie chart, then it works. So if you have a look, it says that beef and lamb pastures there, and dairy pastures, dairy feed and beef feed and so forth. Look at how much land we are using for that. And the ethical considerations there is that we are using this land for all those things, but we're not using it to actually feed ourselves with everything that we actually need. And we're not using it for biodiversity. We're not using it to reforest and all of the things that we need to do in this world where the weather is changing so drastically. So 70% of the land in the UK is devoted to agriculture, mainly livestock and livestock feed and pasture. Then if you look over to the other side, once again, you have the overseas land that's used to feed the UK. And again, these are huge chunks of land that are being used in a very ineffective way to feed people here. Now, all of these things and all of these methods and how we farm and where we farm, all of these different things have an effect on the people where all this farming is actually happening. And the farming, whether it's the deforestation or whether it's the actual intensive animal farms, they have an effect and a contamination effect on those areas and on those people who live there and who work there. So even from a very basic ethical responsibility of the minimum basics that we owe others, they may not be living near us, but all of these practices have real effects on other people, and we have a direct contribution to that. And I would love to have a similar map for the US and for Europe, and maybe someday someone will come up with them, but this study was actually requested by the UK government as part of the National Food Strategy. It's saying how this is not actually sustainable, and it's not going to really work for us in the long term. And interestingly, the UK government wasn't terribly pleased that that's the answer that they got, because they don't really want to change, like many and most systems in the world today. So another aspect of veganism is health, of course. You're going to say, well, can we be healthy and by eating a vegan diet? Yes, it may be the ethical and the moral imperative and the right thing to do by as a basic minimum to other animals, as a basic minimum to other people who are living on the margins of and at the forefront of climate change. But what about what we owe to ourselves? Well, all of these medical and dietary institutions that they're all Anglo, because I really haven't done a thorough study of every single medical and dietary institution on the planet, in terms of languages. But that's a pretty good one. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, that's in the US, Harvard, obviously, in the US. Dietitians of Canada, Dietitian Association of Australia, the British Dietetic Association, National Health Service, that's here in the UK. All of them agree unanimously that being vegan is healthy at any stage in life. So we are not being neglectful of ourselves if we are eating a vegan diet. Obviously, if we're only eating pizza, it doesn't matter what diet you follow, that's going to be problematic. Then the other thing that I often hear is cost. Is people saying, oh, well, being vegan is more expensive and so forth. And sometimes that is the case. Sometimes some vegan products indeed are more expensive, and they are, and it does become a class issue. But food systems and food deserts, and actually the term I prefer using and that I use in the book is food apartheid. There is very much a food apartheid that is happening in the world, pretty much everywhere. And the concern about that is very real and one that needs to be addressed. But we can't then say, well, then it is automatically off the table. Veganism is off the table because a few products may be more expensive. We need to address both and acknowledge that they both can exist at the same time. But in real terms of cost, you have a couple of different things that are going on as well. You have scale, where non-vegan products and animal products are very much already at being prepared at an industrial scale, and they're subsidized as both in terms of subsidies to the farmers and to producers, but as well as to the processing. And even if you take, for example, fast food chains, they're often very much subsidized in terms of tax benefits and special tax brackets that are set up in certain cities and in certain areas, so that the fast food companies can come and set up and more cheaply sell their food, because obviously the subsidies that they're getting through the tax, their tax breaks are very, very helpful. But frankly, if you have a look around and you look at beans, and you look at lentils, you look at even frozen fruit and frozen vegetables, which are completely just as good as the fresh, often they will be much, much cheaper than animal products. And slowly but surely, there is much more price parity in terms of pre-prepared and packaged vegan products that are analogs to non-vegan products. And all these things, all these practical day-to-day considerations have to fit into the basic fairness discussion that I started this talk with, because these are the basic things that we have to deal with every day. And yes, we can intellectualize, we can make the conversation a lot more complex and complicated, and that's all fine and necessary. But really, we need to think about it in its most basic form first and foremost, because we, and I mean, for the most part, I mean, I didn't become vegan until I was 43. So these discussions that seem very basic and very simple, we're not having them, and we need to be having them, and then we can build on that and have the more complex the more complex discussion. But if we don't start having them from a very basic point of view, and where we start thinking about, well, why should we be using animals in the first place, and we should be applying a basic fairness principle, most of us haven't thought about that. I didn't really fully think about that until about 10 years ago. I was 43. And you know, and I don't know if you heard this part, but as I was saying, just today, I was reviewing one of the episodes for the second series of my podcast, where I have two fantastic philosophers that are coming in and talking about the just war theory, and how just war theory can affect, or how animals can fit into that. And that's quite an advanced vegan, if you will. But certainly that has to start from the premises of basic fairness, and whether using animals is a fair and just thing to do in the first place. So I hope that this has been enlightening. I look forward to your questions. If you are interested in the book, it's called Think Like a Vegan. It's available wherever books are sold, or ask your library to carry it, especially if you're in a university system. That would be fantastic. The audiobook is available on all major audiobook platforms, and the podcast is available wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, and whatever else.